Hello. Very happy to have been promoted to professor. I'm not actually a professor. A couple more promotions and you never know. So, if there's still some stamina in the room, I will talk a little. I'm going to talk a little about my book. And I took as a challenge today, really, to give myself no words at all on the screen. And I've got images. So I'm going to go through my book simply with some images. The book really is a set of stories. It's a set of things that have happened, things that happen, and it's interlinked with some analysis and attempts to understand and attempts to make sense of what goes on. I was very interested to hear in the lecture that Christianity achieved the trick of making it the duty of the good to demonize the Jew. And it fits very well because it seems to me that in our time there are people who construct it as the duty of the good to do something similar to Israel and Israelis and Zionism. So my book is the story, or a set of stories, of the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, the moving from the very fringes where it was in the 1980s when I was at university too, and we were fighting those struggles against the banning of Jewish societies and things like that because they were Zionist and therefore they were racist and therefore they violated the anti-racist policy of the Union. We fought all those battles in the 1980s and certainly before as well in the 70s and in previous generations. The story of my book, though, since 2001, and there's a moment in 2001 where there was the well-known conference against racism at Durban, where there was a really successful project to construct the most important racism on the planet as being Zionism. And a week after the Durban conference, there was 9/11, which was kind of symbolic of a new Islamist jihadi resurgence. And a couple of months later was the end of the peace process, or what may turn out to have been the end of the peace process. Some of us are still, on some level, hopeful. But that was a moment in 2001. So the book is about the mainstreaming of these ideas from the kind of Stalinist and crazy far left and the far right into the mainstream since 2001, and we've seen that really quickly in the last few years, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And also the word mainstreaming is important, and the other word is demonization. And of course, we've just heard a lot about demonization in a very literal form. The portraying of the Jew with horns is to demonize, is to make him into the devil. And what we're looking at with contemporary anti-Semitism is various kinds of much more subtle demonization. Contemporary anti-Semitism, but also contemporary racism and contemporary xenophobia doesn't, frankly, understand itself to be so. And it requires interpretation, and it requires thinking, and it requires quite a lot of effort, really, to understand what's going on. So, images. Here's my first image, and this is a graphical representation of what I have called the Livingston formulation, named after Ken Livingstone. And I was always a little shy, actually, about having named the Livingston formulation after him because I thought he wasn't the only guy to do this, and he wasn't the worst to do it. And I did this in 2006, but in recent months and years, Ken Livingstone has really made it his own, and he's really embraced the identity that I gave to him, so I'm very grateful to him for that. So what is the Livingston formulation? People will remember Ken Livingstone got into a rather absurd and trivial argument after a party, and he came out of the party, and a Jewish journalist came up to him and said,
He was the first cousin, Anton's nephew, actually.
The journalist... That's right. Okay, I didn't know this. So he said to Ken Livingstone, give me a quote, how was the party? And Livingstone, who denies having been drunk, he starts kind of abusing the guy. And, oh, go away, you're the bourgeois press, you know. Ugh. And he says, come on, just give me a quote. How was the party? And I've been told, actually, that he was promised a quote from Livingstone's people. And Livingstone sort of turned on him and said, no. And he said, come on, I'm only doing my job. And he says, you're only doing your job. You're just like a Nazi war criminal, a German war criminal. And the guy says, no, you know, just give me a quote. And Livingstone carried on with this sort of, and he said, actually, I'm Jewish. I don't like being called a German war criminal, but it's neither here nor there. Just give me the quote. And this sort of absurd argument came out of nothing. And they all went home. And the next morning, Ken Livingstone woke up with a hangover, and he said, oh no, what have I said? And it's on tape, and people will think I was anti-Semitic, so I'll have to apologize. But he didn't apologize. What he did instead was he wrote an article in The Guardian a little while later, and he said, the reason I get called anti-Semitic is because I'm critical of Israel. And you think, hang on, you were sort of insisting late at night that some Jewish journalist was a Nazi, and how is that criticism of Israel? So the Livingstone formulation is that when somebody raises the issue of anti-Semitism, the kind of standard response is to say, you're raising the issue of anti-Semitism in bad faith because you know that what I'm doing is criticizing Israel, and you're pretending that you're experiencing anti-Semitism in order to silence my voice. The Livingstone formulation is that when Jews complain about experiencing or understanding anti-Semitism, what they're really doing is trying to silence the voice of the oppressed. So here's actually an older image, pre-Livingstone, and it's quite interesting. It has the world trying to talk to President Bush, and then it has the Jew. You can tell he's Jewish, big nose, curly, you know. The Jew trying to talk to President Bush, and there's a cork in Bush's ear. And you kind of wonder, where does the cork come from? Why is there a cork? Why is the whole world united and the Jew different? So it's a kind of precursor. It's not quite the Livingstone formulation. Why is it not the Livingstone formulation? Because the Livingstone formulation doesn't just say to Jews who raise the issue of anti-Semitism that they made a mistake. It doesn't say, yeah, we know you're a bit paranoid. We know about the Holocaust. We know you see anti-Semitism everywhere, behind every tree. It doesn't say that. It says, you're pretending. You're not paranoid, you're not mistaken, but you're lying. And of course, if Jews are lying when they say they've experienced or they've understood anti-Semitism, and if they're all lying together, then there's a conspiracy. So here's another beautifully illustrated example of the Livingstone formulation. The world is worried about the Palestinians, is worried about Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. It holds up its testimony, but the world cannot be heard. The world's mouth is shut, and the world's mouth is shut by this character who has a kippah and an Israeli flag, and he's shutting the world's mouth with this false, fake, bad faith allegation of anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism here isn't racism against Jews. Anti-Semitism here is a mode of silencing the whole world when it wants to speak up for the oppressed. This is done, all of these three cartoons are from the same cartoonist. He's a Brazilian guy called Latuf. Let's just have a look at this very contemporary one. We have Jeremy Corbyn standing here, talking about Palestinian rights. Jeremy Corbyn's good. He's speaking up for the Palestinians. And the Israel lobby, driven by, is that Netanyahu? I think it looks a bit like Ariel Sharon, actually. I don't know if it's just a kind of somebody. I think it must be Netanyahu. The Israel lobby is zooming in one of its nasty American fighter planes in order to shoot Corbyn down. And what is the method it's using to shoot Corbyn down? The method it's using is to accuse him of anti-Semitism. Now, the twist here is, of course, that the people who accuse Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism in the first place are the people who know him. And the people who accuse Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism in the first place are the people who are in the Labour Party and who are worried about the rise of anti-Semitism and who are worried about Corbyn's long history of connections to anti-Semitic politics. But here, the people accusing Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism are the Israeli state, the lobby, the Zionist lobby, and defamation, the Anti-Defamation League. So the twist in this image is that the people who raise the issue of anti-Semitism are not people who are rightly to be understood at home in the Labour Party. The act of raising the issue of anti-Semitism relating to Jeremy Corbyn is an act of disloyalty, is an act of the right, is an act which puts you outside of the community of the good, and is an act which makes you an agent of a foreign racist power. Israel. Latuf, so in the lecture it was mentioned that this image of the devil came first in President Ahmadinejad's competition for Holocaust denial cartoons. Latuf only came third, not with this image but with another image. Latuf is interesting because he's Brazilian and he appears to be an anti-racist, he appears to be somebody of the left. He appears in this image to be a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. He appears to be somebody simply for Palestinian rights. So the question remains, why does President Ahmadinejad of Iran like him so much? And why is he also liked by people like Norman Finkelstein and people on the British left who think that he's our guy? Do you see what I mean? Latuf is a figure who is loved by Ahmadinejad, who's openly a Holocaust denier and who swears to wipe Israel off the map and who parades nuclear weapons through the streets of Tehran with Tel Aviv written on the side. Ahmadinejad is an anti-Semite. Yet he shares his taste in political cartoons with people on the Corbynite left. That's weird, isn't it? Next, please. So, the standard response to the raising of the issue of anti-Semitism is to say, I'm completely not guilty, I'm only criticizing Israel, and you're saying that as a lie in order to silence my criticism of Israel. This image was actually, I think, produced, or at least first publicized by Norman Finkelstein in America. But it's famous because it's one of the images that Naz Shah shared on Facebook. Naz Shah is a Labour MP, and Naz Shah was interesting because, firstly, Naz Shah had a huge amount of goodwill. Why? Because she stood against George Galloway in Bradford East as a Labour candidate and beat him. So Naz Shah herself was somewhat of a dissident within the political community of Islamist politics in Bradford. She stood up against sexism and against all sorts of demonization of her own, and she beat Galloway. So people liked Naz Shah. It then came out that she had shared images like this, and it says, relocate Israel into the United States. And there you see a picture of Israel somewhere in Nebraska, and a whole load of really funny stuff about Israelis are loved by Americans, and the transportation costs would be less than 3 years' defense spending. Palestinians will get their land back and their life back. The Middle East will be peaceful without foreign interference, won't it? When the Jews leave the Middle East, it'll be peaceful because Iran and Saudi Arabia won't be at each other's throats, and the Shia and the Sunni won't be at each other's throats, and the Yazidis will lie down with the lamb, and, you know, all of that stuff. Now, when it came out that Naz Shah had actually in the past Naz Shah was brought up politically in the Respect Party and came to Labour later. So it all got in the Daily Mail, and the Daily Mail denounced her as an anti-Semite. And there was a lot of anti-Semitic material in Naz Shah's past. And what Naz Shah did not do was to say, you're just trying to silence my criticism of Israel. Naz Shah said, hang on, you might have a point. And Naz Shah actually sought out the Jewish community. She came and spent time with a whole number of Labour Jews. I spent a day with Naz Shah talking to her about Israel and anti-Semitism and the rest of it. And Naz Shah apologized, and she said she wanted to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. I'm not here to lionize Naz Shah, but I don't need Naz Shah to become the greatest Zionist on the history of the world. What she did was to think seriously. And then she went to the synagogue in her local constituency and she talked it through at great length. However, while she was doing that, Ken Livingstone was running around the TV stations talking about Hitler and talking about how Hitler, I don't even remember exactly how he got onto Hitler from this image, something about the transportation of the Jews, something. And Ken Livingstone was saying Hitler was supporting Zionism until he went mad and decided to kill the Jews. And Ken Livingstone's story, actually for decades, the story that Ken Livingstone has been trying to push is that there's something similar between Zionism and Nazism. So we talk about demonization. One way of demonizing the Jew is to put horns on him and her. The other way of demonizing the Jew is to say he's like Hitler. What could be more demonic in modern contemporary political culture? This cartoon is from a newspaper called Labour Herald, which was produced in the 1980s, was financed by the Workers' Revolutionary Party. You'll remember Vanessa Redgrave and the others and Jerry Healy, and you'll remember the WRP ended up in all these kind of rape scandals of the lunatic leadership. But it financed this newspaper, and the editor of this newspaper in the early 80s was Ken Livingstone. So when Ken Livingstone says, oh, I didn't mean this, I only said that, Ken Livingstone has been doing this for decades, has been trying to educate young people that Israelis are Nazis. The image is Menachem Begin wearing a Nazi uniform with a Magen David on a pile of bleeding skulls, doing the straight-armed salute. And there's a whole history, which I don't have time to go into, actually, of Jewish anti-Zionists and anti-Zionist Jewish historians who have picked out little pieces of history, and we all now know about the Havara Agreement, don't we? Which was, yeah, of course we do, which was this, little story from Nazi Germany that Ken Livingstone got from Moshe Machover. You don't even want to hear this story about Jewish Trotskyism in the 1980s, but it's still with Livingstone. So while Naz Shah was saying there's a problem of anti-Semitism in the Muslim community, and I'm part of that problem, and I want to fix it, Ken Livingstone's running around mansplaining her in the TV studios, saying she did nothing wrong, she's got nothing to apologize for, and Hitler was a supporter of Zionism because Zionism is kind of like Nazism because it's racist and because they agree that Jews cannot live together in Europe with non-Jews and all the rest of it. So, there is an authentically left-wing tradition and history of anti-Semitism. I'm certainly not one to stand up here and tell you that the left is necessarily or authentically anti-Semitic, because there is also an authentically left-wing history and tradition of opposition to anti-Semitism. And actually, if you follow the history back, you will find that these battles within the left have been going on for a very, very long time, since August Bebel talked about the socialism of fools, and since Bakunin and the people, we could spend a whole hour talking about Marx and whether he was an anti-Semite or an opponent of, but actually Marx was a staunch supporter of Jewish emancipation, and Marx was also somebody who went for the anti-Semites by name. And you'll know their names because you'll remember that Marx wrote about them. Bakunin, Dühring, the other guy who I've forgotten. My good friend Philip Spencer and my mentor Robert Fine, who died last summer, wrote a book about this history of the left, which people should read. And the key takeaway of their book is that the Jewish question is always, in fact, an anti-Semitism question. The Jewish question which asks, what is it that the Jews do in every time and place to make people hate them? What is it that the Jews do to make them unable to fit into normal society? It's always an anti-Semitism question. So here we have and why is there an authentically left-wing anti-Semitism? Because the left worries about how awful the world is. And the left worries that the world looks like a conspiracy, that the rich or the white people, the ruling class, are in charge and benefit from everything. And a kind of lazy way of explaining this is conspiracy theory. So conspiracy theory has always been attractive to some people on the left. And so that's that long story. So this is a Soviet image, you shake the capitalist and the smiling mask comes off and the Jew comes out from underneath. Next one, please. And this is also a Soviet image. And this, you'll see that it says, I don't know how to speak Russian, but it says Zionism. So instead of capitalism being at the heart of the spider's web, and I suspect that the image of the spider is another way of demonizing, another way of saying that the Jews they set their traps and they kind of sit at the heart of the web controlling everything. So here we have the movement from capitalism to Zionism as being the Jewish way of dominating the world. Next, please. Here we have a lovely French image of the Jewish peril, the peril juif, and also the spider. Interestingly, there's not a single horn in my whole presentation, which is a bit of a shame. But you can see that the same task of demonization happens in slightly different ways. Next, please. This is Leon Trotsky. This is a right-wing image from Russia, which is pretty much the same as the other ones we just saw. So some people said that the Bolsheviks were Jews, and some people said that the capitalists were Jews. This is Trotsky with his Magen David. It's not quite right, the Magen David, is it? Anyway, the story, by the way, is that Trotsky was actually the leader of the Russian Revolution, but he refused to take leadership because he said, it'll mess everything up because I'm Jewish. And if I'm the leader, then everyone will say the Jews are in charge. So he gave it to Lenin. You have it, Lenin. Next, please. The top right image is a famous image of, I think about the First World War, in fact, which shows that the arm which holds the olive branch of peace is being cut ruthlessly by capitalism, and the blood is coming out and is flowing all over Europe. And you can see there's another version in which Zionism plays precisely the same symbolic role in the Middle East that capitalism plays in the image in Europe. Now, clearly, and it doesn't really even need to be stated, one can be critical of Israel, can be critical of the political movement of Zionism, one can have arguments about, Netanyahu and Begin and this and that and the other. But also, equally clearly, there's a distinction between discussion and campaigning and making arguments on the one hand, and something more demonizing on the other. And this image, I think, clearly shows not just that Zionism is a problem in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict, that, there is a real conflict. People get killed in the conflict. The Israelis are not angels. There's plenty of room for discussion and for criticism. But what we have here is an image of Zionism as a kind of universal, in the way that capitalism is a universal. Anti-Semitism always put the Jews at the center of the world. Anti-Semitism always put the Jews at the center of everything that's wrong with the world. And there is a certain kind of anti-Zionism which does the same. In fact, if you create a worldview called anti-Zionism, and if you put it, as we saw earlier, for example, there'll be peace in the Middle East if the Jews go to Nebraska. God help the Nebraskans, but in the Middle East, it'll all be all right. Next, please. So Zionism is portrayed as a kind of universal. And this goes back to, I'll come back to it in a minute, actually. This goes back to the Christian stuff, that the Jews' rejection of Christ does not only damn them, it damns all of us. And the Jews clinging to this ideology of Zionism does not only damn them, and it does not only damn the Palestinians, but it gets in the way of everything. And you can see today that Jeremy Corbyn is on the march, and Jeremy Corbyn is on the verge of making a better Britain, a kinder Britain, a more beautiful Britain. And who stands in his way? Who stands in our way between us and the beautiful socialist Britain that Jeremy Corbyn promises? Who stands in the way? It's Zionism. It's the Jewish community. It's all these fake accusations of anti-Semitism. So there is a whole cadre of people on the left who are currently learning the lesson that it's the Jews that stand between us and the good life. And of course this echoes, not just because Jeremy Corbyn has the same initials, but it echoes in its form. These are a couple of older images. I won't go into any great detail. This is John Pilger on the New Statesman, A Kosher Conspiracy, and the next one is Robert Fisk. So these were the kind of actually more marginal voices. As I said, in the 80s it was all quite marginal, and these guys were in the mainstream papers, but they were still kind of marginal. And so that's conspiracy theory. We'll come back to that. This is blood libel. I think still no horns, I'm afraid to tell you. Is there a horn? Heads. So the blood libel is specifically that the Jews are evil. And you can tell that the Jews are evil because they murdered Christ. And their murdering of Christ not only damned them, but it damned us all, and it damned the universal. Next, please. This is a Nazi version of the blood libel. Rich Jews murdering a non-Jewish child. He looks like quite a big child, that one. A sort of adolescent, really. To collect the blood for Jewish ritual for your matzahs or your matzah ball soup or whatever it is you do with your blood. Next, please. What do you think of that image? See, this image could certainly be interpreted as completely innocent. This image could certainly be interpreted as criticism of Israel and criticism of the occupation. This image says boycott Israeli goods. Why? Because of the damage that the Israelis do to the Palestinians in the occupation. Don't squeeze a Jaffa, crush the occupation. I'm not sure, though, because I think the subtext of this image is that the Jews, the Israelis, are trying to give you something to eat which is full of the blood of the non-Jewish children that they've murdered. And you shouldn't eat it. You should boycott it. You shouldn't go near it. Now, I don't believe that the person who designed this image understood that. I mean, I don't know who it is, and you can have your own discussions, yeah? I don't think it requires the person who created this image to say, you know what, I'm an anti-Semite, and I'm going to draw on my own history of anti-Semitism and I'm going to make a really powerful blood libel image. I don't believe that. But I do believe that there's something especially powerful in this image, and the person who created this image knew it. And part of that power is to do with the anti-Semitic history of it. I can't prove it. Maybe I'm wrong. And that's true with a lot of this stuff. But one thing I would say about that is that there's too much of it. There's too many such coincidences. This one's easier. And this is one of the most disgusting blood libel images I've ever seen, actually. It's awful. And I apologize for confronting you with it. The American fork. It's the American fork which is holding the Palestinian child ready to be sliced up and consumed by the greedy Jewish guy with the bib. And there's a cup of blood as well to make the point. And the child looks really lovely and innocent. And I don't think this image could be considered to be criticism of Israel. Next, please. I've got a whole load of blood libel images, actually, that I'm going to skip through quite quickly. This is also from a kind of bygone age, actually. This is from the 90s, I think. Oh, sorry, January 2003. But in today's terms, it's a bygone age. It's before the rise of left populism in Britain, and it's before the rise of Brexit, and it's before the rise of Trump, and it's before the five-star movement took over in Italy, and it's before Orban, and it's before the Polish government, and it's not before Le Pen in France, because the Le Pens have been going on a while. But this was from 2003. This is Ariel Sharon eating a baby. And people said, hang on, the image of evil, cruel Jews eating babies is straight out of the anti-Semitic archive. And Dave Brown said, nah, it's Goya. No, it's nothing to do with anti-Semitism. I'm completely not guilty. Sharon is a murderous bastard, and he does kill children. And many people thought that this was a legitimate image. I wonder how many penises he's got under that Vote Likud rosette. There's a slippage, and there's often a slippage, yes? Israel is involved in a real conflict with the Palestinians. Israel uses a lot of force. Children die in the conflict. Arguably, many children die who don't need to die. Many people under the age of 18 are involved in the conflict. But the slippage is from a nasty and real conflict into the language and the emotional order of anti-Semitism. So from a conflict in which many people under the age of 18 are involved and get killed and injured, to Israel as a child-murdering state. People remember Tariq Ali. I remember hearing Tariq Ali explain that Israel murders children and it does it on purpose. And you can tell, because the evidence is in the morgues in Palestine, that the bodies of babies and children come into the morgues and they have bullets right dead center between their eyes. And so the slippage from a nasty little conflict over land between two people who don't like each other much at the moment, the slippage from that into Israel murders children on purpose because it wants to. That's quite some slippage. Next, please. That's kind of self-explanatory. Next, please. I don't know. I don't read Arabic. I don't even know if that is Arabic. Anybody know? Next, please. Here we have Nazi Israeli helicopters sending bombs to explode a baby milk bottle. By the way, I've never really even noticed, but the image of a milk bottle swimming in a sea of blood is quite resonant for people who keep kosher, really, isn't it? You can see many things you can see into these images, and what I can definitely see is that the Israelis are Nazis. That the people who did murder our children by the hundreds of thousands are what people are saying about Jews today. And you can always tell, by the way, listen to what people say about Jews and listen to what anti-Semites say about Israel, because that way you know what their own fantasies are. So what it is that they accuse the Jews of doing is what they want themselves to do. That's from Sartre, and I think that makes a certain sense. Carry on, please. Here's a nice blood libel image. The murdering of Jesus. It doesn't even hide. Do not kill him twice. And the guy killing Jesus a second time is an Israeli soldier. And Jesus is innocent and allowing himself to be crucified. And that's a very clear image. Next, please. And there's something very bare and simple about this image. There's nothing Israeli or nothing about anything except for the Jewish Star of David piercing a child and killing it, and the innocent child and the blood dripping out. But it's just criticism of Israel, you understand. So the way that these debates happen, when you say, hang on, sometimes the hostility to Israel becomes anti-Semitic, or sometimes the tropes mirror anti-Semitic tropes, or sometimes the amount of enthusiasm are disproportionate. And the response is not, yeah, you're right, sometimes people who want you to boycott Israel get a bit overexcited and they key into their own anti-Semitic tradition. It's not that. That's not the response. The response is, how very dare you? How very dare you say that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic? Oh, wow. This is Dieudonné. People know Dieudonné Mbala is a French comedian. And his idea of fun is to talk about the Shoah as a pineapple. I can't do it. Show ananas. And he says that the Shoah is the kind of root of Jewish power. That's why it works when Jews accuse Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism, because they're disgracefully mobilizing the power of the Holocaust. You saw the image before of the angelic Jew going into the Holocaust and the demonic Jew coming out. And by the way, that demonic Jew is also the neurotic Jew. So why are the Jews unable to live alongside other people in the Middle East? Because they were driven neurotic by the Holocaust. And you'll see that in many, many very respectable academic theses and writing. Next, please. You'll tell me when you had enough of me, won't you? Nobody's laughing. Maybe that means you have had enough. This is Nicholas Anelka. People remember the quenelle. Anybody remember the quenelle? So what was the quenelle? What is he doing? What is Nicholas Anelka doing? He scored a goal. That was his moment when he's on TV. What is he doing? He's sticking out his right arm, but his right arm kind of wants to go up into a Hitler salute, but something's stopping it. Have I got my left and my right? Right, I think I have. And it's his left arm that's stopping his right arm. His left arm is Jewish power. His left arm is the Jews' power to tell him what to do and to tell him what not to do. So this image of the quenelle was another version of the Livingston formulation, that talk about anti-Semitism is nothing but an assertion of Jewish power. Here's the famous image that Jeremy Corbyn stood up for. Jeremy Corbyn has a habit of standing with anti-Semites against Jews. When the Jews, one of the Jewish organizations, I think the Community Security Trust, says this is an anti-Semitic image. And actually, this is kind of both a blood libel and a conspiracy image at the same time. And Corbyn said, how very dare you try to silence this anti-capitalist message? And then 4 years later, it became a kind of issue. And he said, yeah, I suppose you're right. But how did you get this wrong? As Howard Jacobson said, you could have been driving past there at 100 miles an hour checking your emails, and you still would have known it was an anti-Semitic image. Next, please. These are two cartoons from this summer, written by Steve Bell in The Guardian. Completely mainstream newspaper, completely mainstream left-wing cartoonist. And it's taking the piss out of people who oppose anti-Semitism. It's ridiculing them. It's making them ridiculous. And it says up there, we utterly reject the Oxford English Dictionary definition of sanctimonious humbugs. You've got Chuka Amunia there, Chief Rabbi, Tom Watson, Frank Field, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, Margaret Hodge, Neil Kinnock. Who's that one on his right? I don't know. Who is that? What? It looks like Hattersley, but I don't think Hattersley opposes anti-Semitism. Anyway, sorry if that's a libel, Roy. These people are ridiculous. These people who want to stand up for the internationally recognized definition of anti-Semitism, which has some guidelines about hostility and demonization of Israel. People will know the Labour Party debate. There's a whole chapter about the definition in my book. But the cartoon's very clear. The people who worry about anti-Semitism are really hypocritical humbugs. Next, please. And this was the day after Steve Bell hadn't finished. This was Steve Bell saying that the demand made on Jeremy Corbyn, the demand that he's silenced, and now the demand is remove your own head, put it on this pole, then we can talk. So there's a kind of real notion of Jewish power, that the criticism of anti-Semitism, the insistence by a huge consensus in the Jewish community that the Labour Party take this issue seriously, is portrayed by Steve Bell in The Guardian as the powerful, the elite, asserting their Jewish power over Jeremy Corbyn. This one's cheating, really, because this is not an anti-Semitic cartoon, but I thought it was quite funny. Jeremy says, we must show the country we're not anti-Semitic. And then he says, but what if it's a Zionist trap? There you go. And down here, writing Jewish Trump fanatics is the guy, I can't remember his name now, Wilsman, Steve Wilsman, who made that speech that was recorded and went out on the internet, who said that the people who oppose anti-Semitism in the Labour Party are Trump fanatics. In other words, Jews in the Labour Party who oppose anti-Semitism do not belong in the Labour Party, they belong with Trump. And how do you get more demonic in contemporary left-wing discourse than Trump? Next, please. And I did my fantastic book, I've only got 3 books there, so you have to fight for them, on left anti-Semitism, and it came out a year ago. And just as I was finishing it, something surprised me, which is that there was also a resurgence not only of anti-Semitism, but also of xenophobia and racism on the right. And I had thought, I actually saw a video of myself talking in 2006, and I said, you know, fascistic anti-Semitism is a thing of the past, and I got that wrong. In Hungary, George Soros is depicted, Soros is the new Rothschild, right? You might like Soros, you might not like Soros. You might think he's a demonic left-wing character, you might think he's a right-winger. But the way that Soros gets caricatured as an anti-Semitic caricature is very clear. Firstly, Soros is the man who made his cash by betting against the pound, wasn't he, in one of the currency crises. So Soros is a man of finance capital, right? Not decent, hard-working, white, muscly, proletarian, productive capital, but wasteful, disgraceful, Jewish global finance capital. This poster was up in Hungary saying, don't let Soros have the last laugh. And we know, and we're used to this, by the way. We've seen Jewish organizations and Jewish anti-Zionism apologize for all sorts of anti-Semitic discourse. We've seen it for years. And what's kind of new is when the Prime Minister of Israel does the same thing when he goes to Hungary and apologizes for the Hungarian government, which drives some of this conspiracy theory against George Soros. Next, please. Here we have Soros pictured as it's like a spider, isn't it? The octopus with the tentacles. Soros is the conspiracy. Soros is the money man. Soros is behind all the evil on the planet. Next, please. Soros is the puppet master. Soros is in charge of the Pope. Next, please. This is an image from Leave EU, from one of the Brexit organisations, which shows Soros controlling David Lammy. David Lammy is very cheap, apparently. You can buy David Lammy for £2,700 worth of flights and hotels. I mean, wow. Next, please. This is George Soros controlling President Obama. So you see what I mean? You can criticize George Soros, you can disagree with George Soros. There's no problem with that. But the way that Soros is kind of mobilized in a discourse of global power is unmistakably anti-Semitic. Next, please. And here we have also a Leave EU tweet showing Soros controlling Tony Blair, the puppet master. And of course, I mean, again, one can have all sorts of legitimate criticisms of the European Union, but one can also treat the European Union as part of a global conspiracy to do down the Brits and as if the European Union is the key thing which is in between Britain and happiness. Next, please. And here's a kind of original Nazi image of the puppet master, the Jew who's controlling the rich and the powerful, and the rich and the apparently powerful. Next, please. And this is Donald Trump. This is not an image, is it? So I'm cheating. And this was last week around the Kavanaugh affair and the argument about sexual harassment of the guy they wanted to put on the Supreme Court. Paid for by Soros. The campaign against Kavanaugh, the claims that he was guilty of sexual abuse, sexual violence, paid for by Soros. Soros was under. This is the President of the United States. Right? So when I said that xenophobia and anti-Semitism has been moving from the fringes into the mainstream, it took Donald Trump a week to be able to say that the Nazis who marched at Charlottesville were un-American. Because his original position, given to him by Steve Bannon, was that there are good people on both sides. Next, please. Here we have another puppet picture from Steve Bell. Steve Bell's still working, yes? You might think that these are very clearly anti-Semitic cartoons, but Steve Bell is working for the most important left-of-centre newspaper in this country. Next, please. And this is not quite, it's a bit cheaty as well. This is Nigel Farage with his image of hordes of foreigners being sent here by the European Union and by the cosmopolitans and the globalists and the people behind the European Union in order to swamp Britain. Next, please. And here we have an image showing a Trojan horse of ISIS filled with Muslims, filled with refugees, gaining entry to Europe by stealth. So, next, please. So this is my final image. And I don't know if anybody recognizes it, but it's quite dear to me, this image, because I have an original of it. Well, not an original, but from the newspaper, because they were collected by my grandfather when he first came to Britain from Germany, and he's got a whole load of these cartoons. And the cartoon shows Adolf Hitler doffing his hat to Joseph Stalin, "The scum of the earth, I believe." And Joseph Stalin bows back, "Yes, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume." And dead bodies, presumably of Poland, in between the two of them. And it seems to me that, and I certainly will not say to you anything like Jeremy Corbyn is like Hitler, or Nigel Farage is like Hitler, or Donald Trump is like Hitler. That's not what I'm here to say. But what I will say is that anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia has moved into legitimate mainstream discourse in Europe and in America in a way that was unthinkable just 3 or 4 years ago. And I will say that there are cadres of political people learning the lessons that they're being betrayed, on the one hand by the foreigners and the Europeans and Juncker and Soros, and Brexit will be a betrayal of the people. Sorry, the failure to Brexit may be a betrayal of the people. And on the other hand, a cadre on the left being built around the lesson that the Jews are the enemy of the left. And whatever happens in Britain and whatever happens in Europe, people are embracing these lessons. And there's a weird reversal going on, that some people are trying to portray anti-Semitism and racism as a kind of healthy cry of the oppressed. That when you see anti-Semitism, it's portrayed as a kind of raw cry of anger of the Palestinians. Or when you see xenophobia or racism, it's portrayed in America or in Britain as a kind of raw cry of the oppressed white working class. And the people opposing anti-Semitism and opposing racism are said to be the elite, the cosmopolitans, the money men, the financiers, the globalists. So that's the shape of the kind of emergence that really frightens me. And just one final point, which I think is very important to me. There are many people on the left who can really see and understand right-wing anti-Semitism. And there are many people on the right who can really see and understand and are frightened by left-wing anti-Semitism. But there are very, very many of the very same people who cannot see it when it's in their own political family. And the right shouts, "Look, the anti-Semitism is over there on the left." And the left shouts, "Look, the real anti-Semitism is over there on the right." And the Jews get stuck in the middle. So that's what frightens me. Thank you very, very much.
Like so many of Spiral Arts events, this one was extremely stimulating. I was not expecting to get 2 events in one, but both were extremely entertaining, apart from being very educational. I was pleased also, having seen Anton Felton's expose of cartoons and so on about anti-Semitism. It was most instructive to hear about the anti-Semitism of the left in contemporary society, and I was also pleased that towards the end there was also mention of anti-Semitism of the right, which is another danger, and of course with which I was brought up, as a result of which I always was pro-Labour until very recently, and I have been forced recently to consider my position.
Picked. And I thought that, is it David Hirsh?
Yes.
I mean, that was a tour de force in explaining anti-Semitism and how the visual image is so important nowadays, because we don't read, we look. And I thought that was tremendous. I'm a Guardian reader. Can I say that? Am I allowed to say that?
You're allowed to say that.
Thank you. And what? Funny enough, I've been on the same platform as Steve Bell. Yeah, but we're talking about comedy, and he's when you meet him, he's a very kind of cuddly big guy, very full of bonhomie. But I think maybe in the cartoons, has got that one-sided left-wing view. But on the other hand, we have a situation in Israel with a right-wing government giving anti-Semitism, fueling anti-Semitism every day, the way that their policies do confront for the world, the way that young Arabs are gunned down. But it's a very one-sided view that Steve Bell gives, but Benjamin Netanyahu does not help. No.
And have you been to any other Spiral Arc events?
A long time ago, but not recently, but I might be a convert to the insidious Spyrism that is grabbing.
You enjoy the atmosphere?
Yeah, I like the atmosphere, and so I thought they did very well, and I like the synagogue atmosphere. I might come back into Judaism. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, I'll give you a secret. I have a hobby. Every night I Google to find out if people are Jewish. And I've just checked, the chief rabbi is definitely Jewish.
I'm glad you found that out because I've not been sure. So I'm glad you found that
I'm
out.
going to break it to him tonight.
Very good. Thank you.